Welcome to Khadija Talimwali YouTube channel.
Imagine you have exactly 30 seconds to convince someone not to leave a room. Like, what do you even say?
Right, that is a lot of pressure.
Exactly. And if you consult a modern YouTube algorithm, it will just hand you this hyper-optimized, mathematically tested script.
Yeah, but generations of storytellers, scattered across entirely different cultures, have accomplished that exact same feat using just a handful of very specific words.
It really is the ultimate psychological trick. And welcome to today's deep dive, by the way.
We're so glad you're here.
Yeah.
Because when the dark closes in, whether that dark is a literal pitch black room or just a metaphorical season of despair, we don't just reach for a match, we reach for a narrative.
We really do. And we have an incredibly eclectic stack of sources for you to look at today.
Yeah.
We are pulling from articles on Urdu children's literature, vocabulary guides.
Including that massive 24,000-word offline dictionary by Wasim Siddiqui.
Yes. Plus modern digital script writing templates, and finally, a deep literary analysis of Kate DiCamillo's acclaimed novel, The Tale of Despero.
On the surface, you are looking at algorithmic data sheets sitting right next to a story about a cartoon mouse.
Right, that seems super disconnected.
But the mission of this deep dive is to explore the underlying architecture connecting them. We're going to uncover how stories help you process the most complex, terrifying emotions in your life.
And how finding the precise vocabulary for your pain is often the only way to actually survive it.
Exactly.
So let's start with the pure mechanics of that 30-second window we mentioned. Our sources provide this brutal contrast in how we capture human attention.
Oh, the script templates.
Yeah, I was looking at this Urdu and Hindi YouTube script writing template, and the rules are entirely metric-driven. You have 30 seconds.
And if you don't hit the right beats, you're done.
Right. In that window, you must deliver a high-energy hook, tease 3 to 5 specific value points, and set up a call to action. It treats human attention like this fragile, fleeing commodity.
Because in a digital landscape, it kind of is,
Yeah.
The algorithm actively punishes you if your retention graph dips at second 31. The creator is essentially begging the viewer to stay.
Begging. But then you look at the traditional storytelling approach. The original 30-second hook doesn't beg at all.
No, it really doesn't.
It's just 4 words in English, once upon a time, or, as it appears in the Urdu traditions we reviewed, ek dafa ka zikr hai.
That phrase operates so differently than a digital hook. It's a verbal contract.
Yeah.
It tells the listener to suspend their current reality and enter a shared psychological space. It's a command, not a plea.
So if an Urdu storyteller uses that traditional invocation to pull a child into a story, what happens when the child actively tries to break the contract?
Which kids totally do.
All the time. And that is exactly the tension at the center of this brilliant story we found in our sources. It's written by Shem Danish Peikel.
Right, originally published in Monthly Zakoshak and adapted for audio by the digital platform Awaz Urdu.
Yeah. So we're introduced to Chacha Chatru, who is this man telling bedtime stories to his brother's children. And Chacha isn't some, master innovator.
No, he's just reciting the recycled fables of his own youth, and every single one opens with that verbal tether, once upon a time.
And sitting in his audience is Cameron. Now, Cameron is basically every storyteller's worst nightmare.
Oh, he is the ultimate heckler.
He is talkative, he is stubborn, and he absolutely refuses to accept the verbal contract. He constantly interrupts Cha-Cha Chatru to interrogate the actual mechanics of the story.
He wants to know why everything has to start with once upon a time.
Right, he argues, he derails the plot, he's irritating the storyteller and frustrating all the other kids in the room who just want to hear the fable.
He is providing immense friction. But eventually, Cameron just simply runs out of steam. He stops fighting the premise, lies down, and goes entirely silent.
Wait, I have to admit I was actually confused reading this part. Cameron is ruining the show. When he finally shuts up, shouldn't Cha-Cha Chatru and the other kids be thrilled?
You would think so, right?
Yeah, I would assume the storyteller just takes a breath of relief and finishes the tale. Why does the energy in the room suddenly die?
Well, it reveals a really profound truth about the mechanism of group emotional dynamics. Storytelling, especially in an intimate setting, is never a passive broadcast. It is a co-creation.
Oh, I see.
Cameron's interruptions, as annoying as they were, provided a dynamic feedback loop. The friction he introduced was actually the spark giving the room life. So when he goes silent, he leaves a massive emotional void.
Okay, let's unpack this, because Cameron is basically the human equivalent of the modern YouTube algorithm.
Oh. He really is.
He's a tough, cynical crowd demanding a better hook, and he's refusing to just passively consume content. But his sudden absence shows us that the power of the session had almost nothing to do with the actual plot of Cha Cha Trushu's recycled story.
Right.
The magic was the shared connection in the room.
And this totally shatters a very common misconception about children's literature. We often treat it as a pacifier, something brightly colored to just keep kids quiet and distracted.
Just put them to sleep.
Exactly. But this Urdu tale proves it's actually a highly sophisticated sandbox. It's a safe space for children to test boundaries, challenge authority figures like Cha-Cha, and experience sudden shifts in a group's emotional climate without any real-world danger.
But let's talk about that specific emotional climate, because that void come around leaves is kind of hard to articulate. If you asked an English-speaking child to describe how the room felt after the heckler went quiet, they'd likely say it felt empty or just sad.
Those words are functional, sure, but they entirely lack the nuance of what actually occurred in that room. The English language can be very literal. It evolved heavily around commerce, transaction, and measurable action.
Which explains why Wasim Siddiqui's offline dictionary is so fascinating. To successfully bridge English and Roman Urdu, his dictionary requires over 24,000 words.
It's massive.
Think about the linguistic friction there. Why does it take 24,000 entries just to map the translation of everyday experiences?
Because Urdu is a language that evolved through centuries of poetic and courtly tradition. It doesn't just label an action.
Right.
It labels the intricate emotional shadow cast by that action. Siddiqui's massive volume proves that translating a human experience is rarely just a one-to-one swap.
We see this beautifully illustrated in the source material from Dynalingo, which is an educational platform building language apps for kids.
They do a great job with this.
They really do. They highlight several untranslatable Urdu words that give highly specific vocabulary to those nameless, lingering feelings we all have. For instance, the word udasi.
Right, if you just look up udahasi, a crude translation might spit out sadness. But that completely strips it of its architecture.
How so?
Udasi is specifically a soft, lingering sadness that is actually more peaceful than it is painful. It's like the quiet melancholy of a rainy Sunday afternoon.
Oh, I love that. Then there is Kawar, which is peace, but a very specific type of emotional stillness, a settling of the soul. And Takdir, meaning the weight of fate or destiny, which hangs over so many traditional fables. But the one that really stumped me in the Dynalingo source was Hazrat. How do we even translate that concept to an English speaker?
Hazrat is this wistful, profound longing for something that is just out of your reach. It's the ache for a life you aren't currently living or a thing you just cannot possess.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If you want to teach a young child a massive, abstract concept like Hazrat, you cannot just hand them Siddiqui's dictionary.
No, definitely not.
A definition doesn't teach an emotion. Dynalingo tackles this by using interactive poetry walls and animated stories. They don't just put the word on a screen.
Right, they build a visual narrative.
Exactly. Perhaps a character watching a ship sail away and they label the feeling of the moment. They give the child a container for the emotion.
What's fascinating here is the psychological mechanism at play. Language dictates our reality. Imagine a child who suddenly feels a wave of peaceful melancholy. If the only vocabulary word they own is sad, which is a word they closely associate with scraped knees, punishment, and crying, they might panic.
Oh, wow. Yeah, they'd assume something is broken and needs to be fixed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But by handing them a word like udasi, you give them permission to simply exist inside that peaceful sadness without anxiety. You legitimize their internal world.
And we desperately need that as adults, too. Think about how many adults are sitting in a corporate boardroom feeling a deep sense of udasi.
Right.
But because our English vocabulary defaults to words like depressed or unhappy, we think we need to immediately medicate it or fix it. What if we just had the right word to sit with it?
We spend decades fighting our own emotions simply because we lack the architectural vocabulary to properly house them.
And if we want to talk about someone who took that specific emotion of Hazrat, that intense, wistful longing for something out of reach and built an entire empire out of it, we have to look at Kate DiCamillo.
Oh, absolutely. Before she became a two-time Newbery Medal-winning author, Kate DiCamillo was the absolute physical embodiment of wistful longing.
For roughly a decade, she was a total outsider. She worked these odd, grueling margin of society jobs. She worked at Disney World, literally just standing there telling guests to watch your step.
Yeah.
She worked at Circus World, she worked at campgrounds, she worked in greenhouses. She was watching everyone else move along these prescribed, successful paths while she was totally adrift.
She was so desperate to feel like she belonged to the literary world that she even admitted to buying black turtlenecks.
Oh my gosh, really?
Yeah, she wanted to look world-weary and sophisticated. She was trying to put on the costume of a writer because she hadn't yet realized that to actually be a writer, you have to sit down and do the agonizing work of writing.
And when she finally did start submitting her work, the literary world did not welcome her with open arms. She collected nearly 400 rejection letters.
That number is just insane.
400. I read that number and thought, how does a human ego even survive that? But she had this staggering revelation. She said, I decided a long time ago that I didn't have to be talented. I just had to be persistent.
But, persistence alone doesn't create masterpieces.
Yeah.
What those 400 rejections actually did was systematically dismantle her ego, leaving behind a profound capacity for empathy.
Which brings us to the creation of her first published novel, Because of Winn-Dixie. The origins... Living in Minnesota during a season locals called the worst winter on record. She compared the biting, relentless climate to Siberia.
Just freezing.
The cold was so aggressive that pieces of cars were literally snapping off in the streets. She was trapped in the dark, she was deeply homesick for the warmth of Florida where she grew up, and she desperately wanted a dog, but her apartment building absolutely forbade them.
So she is stripped of warmth, she is stripped of her home, and she's completely denied companionship.
Exactly. So what is the mechanism of survival here? She makes a dog up.
Yeah.
She takes all that wistful longing, she channels it through a pen at 4:30 in the morning in a freezing room, and she writes herself a pathway back to Florida. She takes Hazrat and manifests it onto the page.
And it worked.
It really did. Years later, she is sitting on the movie set for the film adaptation of Because of Winn-Dixie. Dave Matthews is playing a song for a scene, and she just breaks down crying.
Wow.
Because something she conjured in the absolute dark to save her own sanity was now a physical, breathing reality right in front of her.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, her decade working those odd jobs at Disney and the greenhouses wasn't a delay in her career, it was a vital incubation period.
Right.
Her time as an outsider gave her the exact psychological lens she needed to write for children.
Because kids inherently feel like outsiders. They are powerless in a world governed by towering, unpredictable adults.
Exactly. DiCamillo's 400 rejections taught her exactly what it feels like to have the door slammed in your face over and over.
And she takes that empathy, that deep understanding of what it means to be small and dismissed, and she builds an entire ecosystem out of it.
Which brings us to the culmination of our deep dive, the tale of Despereaux.
Yes. DiCamillo weaves the empathy of the outsider, the nuanced vocabulary of emotional longing, and the verbal contract of once upon a time into one brilliant text.
It's incredible.
But what fascinated me in the literary analysis from our sources is that she doesn't just give us a hero to root for, she creates a complete ecosystem of trauma and then shows us how different characters process that trauma.
Let's look at the psychological profiles of these characters, starting with Despereaux Tilling. He is a mouse, but he is a physical anomaly.
Right.
Tiny, frail, born with ridiculously oversized ears. He refuses to scavenge for crumbs like a normal mouse. Instead, he's drawn to music. He's drawn to the light. He actually falls in love with a human, Princess P.
And for this absolute failure to conform, the Mouse Council condemns him to the dungeon. They throw him into the pitch black.
And what is his survival mechanism? He doesn't look for a weapon.
No. He says out loud to the darkness, once upon a time. He uses the traditional storyteller's tether as a magic spell to protect his own mind.
But DiCamillo contrasts Despereaux's survival tactic with Roscuro. Now, Roscuro is a rat who lives down in that very same dungeon.
And DiCamillo isn't subtle with her naming conventions here. Roscuro's full name is chiaroscuro, literally embodying that Renaissance art technique of placing extreme, brilliant light directly against impenetrable, heavy dark.
Right.
That artistic tension is his exact psychological profile.
He is a creature of the dark who becomes dangerously obsessed with the light upstairs. But when he ventures into the human world, he's met with horror and violence.
It's awful.
And the narrator explicitly tells us that his heart was broken, and when it healed crooked.
I cannot get over that phrase, a heart healing crooked.
It's so visceral.
It is. Instead of using storytelling to process his pain like Despereaux does, Risturo processes his trauma through revenge, and his revenge revolves around soup.
Which sounds completely absurd.
Right, until you realize that in the world of this book, soup is the ultimate mechanism of warmth, comfort, and safety. It is the literal antidote to the dark. Roscuro wants to steal the light because he was denied it.
Then you have Migri-Sao, the human servant girl. She is sold for a handful of cigarettes and a red tablecloth, physically abused until her ears resemble cauliflower.
Oh, it's so dark.
It is. And how does she process her trauma? Through pure delusion. She clings to the impossible fantasy that she will simply become a princess. Roscuro weaponizes her Hazrat, her wistful longing to manipulate her into helping him kidnap Princess P.
Even the adults in this world are utilizing tethers to survive the dark. Gregory the jailer navigates the pitch-black maze of the dungeon by keeping a physical rope tied around his ankle.
Just so it doesn't get swallowed by the void.
Exactly. And he tells Despero he will only save his life under one condition. Despero must tell him a story.
Look at Hovis the Threadmaster. He is the mouse tasked with tying the red thread of death around the necks of those condemned to the dungeon. It's a symbol of execution. But when Despero willingly embraces his quest to save the princess, Hovis gives him an entire spool of that same red thread to use as a lifeline to navigate the maze. The mechanism of condemnation actually becomes the tool for salvation.
And DiCamillo refuses to sugarcoat any of this for her young readers. There is a pivotal quote from the analysis. Everything cannot always be sweetness and light.
No, it can't.
The narrative forces you to look at cruelty. It forces you to look at the fact that parents can fail you profoundly. Despero's own father, Lester, is the one who beat the drum that formally sentenced his son to the dungeon.
Which sets up what is arguably the most difficult, illogical moment in the entire narrative. When Lester is weeping, begging his son for forgiveness,
Yeah.
Despero actually gives it to him.
I had to stop reading for a second when I hit that part because it doesn't make any sense. Why on earth would you forgive the parent who sent you to be eaten by rats?
It's wild.
DiCamillo herself writes in the book, forgiveness is a ridiculous thing too.
It is entirely ridiculous from a logical standpoint.
Right.
But from an emotional standpoint, it's the only mechanism that works.
Right.
DiCamillo is showing the reader that if Despero hold on to his justified anger, his heart will heal crooked, just like Roscuro's did. Forgiveness isn't about absolving Lester. It's about Despero preserving his own capacity for light.
So what does this all mean? When you zoom out, Despero isn't a traditional knight. He isn't swinging a sword to slay a dragon. His true superpower is his empathy.
Absolutely.
His entire terrifying quest into the dungeon is about achieving Korar, that highly specific Urdu word for emotional stillness we talked about. And he achieves it by making the hardest, most logical choice of them all.
This raises an important question about why humans ever began telling stories in the first place. DiCamillo explicitly tells her audience that the world is dangerous.
Yeah.
But much like a child learning the word udasi to map their sadness without panicking, DiCamillo positions the narrative itself as a lantern in the dark.
Stories of light. That is what Gregory the jailer realizes.
Empathy is the bridge that allows DiCamillo to connect the incredibly disparate traumas of a fragile mouse, a resentful rat, a deluded servant girl, and a grieving princess.
Right.
The story allows us, the readers, to inhabit their pain, to feel their Hazrat, without being permanently destroyed by it.
It acts just like the rope around Gregory's ankle, or the red thread from Hovis. The story is the tether that lets you wander deep into the terrifying, pitch-black parts of the human experience, knowing you have a guaranteed path back out.
And that is the true architecture of storytelling. It has nothing to do with algorithmic retention graphs or 30-second digital hooks.
No.
It's about providing a robust vocabulary for the nameless terrors that haunt us.
Look at the incredible map we've traced today. We started with the friction in a room full of children, learning that storytelling is a co-created space that even a heckler like Kamran relies on for joy.
We learned that finding the exact right word, like Hazrat, doesn't just translate a feeling, it legitimizes our internal reality.
We saw how Kate DiCamillo allowed 400 rejections to strip away her ego, leaving behind a superpower of empathy that she channeled right into the freezing Minnesota dark.
And it all converged in a tiny, large-eared mouse who proved that while forgiveness might be mathematically ridiculous, it is the only reliable way to keep your heart from healing crooked.
You, the listener, are constantly consuming data. You are reading articles, you're prepping for meetings, absorbing facts. But it is so vital to pause and examine the emotional vocabulary of what you are learning.
empathy and persistence are not fixed personality traits that you are simply born with.
No, they are muscles. They require just as much intentional practice, friction, and conditioning as any technical skill you employ in your career.
Data and facts provide you with the map, but an intricate emotional vocabulary is what gives you the actual ability to walk the terrain.
So we want to leave you with one final, lingering thought based on the hard-won wisdom of Gregory the Jailer. Stories are light. Think about the most difficult, darkest seasons in your own life. When the lights go out and you find yourself standing in your own metaphorical dungeon. Wait, let me rephrase that. When you're in that dark, what is the internal narrative you are constructing?
Right.
Are you weaving a story of resentment where your heart heals crooked? Or despite the terrifying dark, are you brave enough to take a breath, grab the red thread, and write your own Once Upon a Time?
Something to carefully consider.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep telling your stories.
Thank you for watching Khadija Talimwali YouTube channel.